Dr. Pathak, Mr. Panda, Sameer Kochar, Dr. Rathin Roy, Dr. Lavish Bhandari, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am honored and humbled at the decision of the Scotch Foundation to confer this award on me. I am also somewhat delighted because traditionally when such awards have been conferred, they have tended to say lifetime awards. So I am grateful that it does not say a lifetime award. Sameer Kochar is someone whom you know very well, and therefore you are also aware that Sameer generally tends to tell you what he wants you to speak about. He doesn't leave it to you. So he has thrust a topic on me which says India towards a 10 trillion US dollar economy. Now this is something on which one can go on for hours and hours. I don't have hours and hours. I have about 15 minutes to make some stray remarks on this particular topic. So therefore, I shall do that almost in bulleted fashion. First of all, notice that though it says towards a $10 trillion economy, it does not mention the timeline. Obviously, if we wait long enough, somewhere down the line in the unforeseeable future, India will become a $10 trillion economy. But that's neither here nor there. What is important is to try and pin down what kind of timeline we have in mind. And I think there are two kinds of timelines which are implicit in that statement. The first one is 2030, and the second one happens to be 2040. Remember those 2 years, 2030 and 2040, and I will come back to those. Let me now return to where the Honorable Minister for Commerce and Industry left off, because that is the way most economists and some of my fraternity and sorority are represented here, including here on the panel. Most economists will tend to think of it in terms of inputs: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. And one of the issues we are talking about is a greater degree of input usage to generate growth, and related to that, B, a greater efficiency in the use of those inputs. Take, for instance, land. We know land is a contentious issue, but we also know that land is very inefficiently used in India. When I say land is inefficiently used, there are a whole bundle of issues connected with land. It's not only about ownership of land, as people sometimes tend to think, because land is, after all, a bundle of rights. And the fact of the matter is, it is inefficiently used because we don't even have a system of very clear land titling. If you do not have a very clear system of land titling, you cannot really think in terms of converting that land into some kind of productive use. And one of the things I just want to mention in passing is that there are several initiatives that are going on to improve the land titling part of it, cleaning up land records, all of which facilitates more efficient usage of land, more conversion of land for more productive purposes, also facilitates urbanization. And worldwide, urbanization tends to be correlated with economic growth and economic development. Traditionally, India has had very low rates of urbanization. The rates of urbanization have been going up, and indeed that urbanization needs to be better managed. Most of the time when we complain about urbanization, we are not per se complaining about urbanization, we are complaining about the form that urbanization takes. From land, let me move on to labor. On labor too, we are talking about a whole variety of issues. It is not only about labor laws as sometimes is interpreted in terms of the Industrial Disputes Act, specifically Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act. That's a very small, tiny bit. Labor is also about other labor laws. Labor is also about breaking down the traditional dichotomy that has existed between organized labor on one side and unorganized labor on the other side. We have a system where there are very stringent labor laws which protect a very small segment of the workforce, and there is the other segment which is about 92%, which is outside the purview of any kind of protection. To the extent that protection exists in the form of legislation, it is rarely enforced. We are talking about education, we are talking about skills, we are talking about increasing the participation of women in the workforce. If the participation of women in the workforce in India were to even remotely approach the levels in East Asia, the path to that $10 trillion would become easier. The third set of issues is capital, and again the Honorable Minister mentioned this. Here also we are talking about increases in savings rate, fueled by income growth, fueled by more people moving into higher income growth, higher income levels. We are talking about the young population, the so-called demographic dividend, which also feeds into the process. We are talking about investments, not only domestic, but also foreign, which improves enhances the capital. And of course, the competition. And notice, after a very, very long time, the exit of capital has begun to happen. Competition does not only mean entry, it also requires exit. That, therefore, fuels a greater degree of efficiency in the use of capital. As the Minister said, it brings down what economists call the capital output ratio, or the incremental capital output ratio. And then in those traditional growth theory terms, we have entrepreneurship, which is something that economists and other people find very difficult to understand and pin down, but if you travel across India, you will get this sense of entrepreneurship happening. More and more people are not seeking government jobs. More and more people are not seeking jobs. More and more people are seeking to provide others jobs. In addition to these, let me now mention 4 other bulleted points. The first one is a purely statistical one. It's a purely statistical one because the share of agriculture in national income is declining. narrowly defined agriculture. And if the share of agriculture in national income declines, and agriculture does not grow as fast as what are called the secondary or the tertiary sectors, automatically this gives an additional impetus to overall GDP growth. But the next one that I want to mention is even more important, and it is rarely talked about, and that is a change in the institutional system. When we talk about markets, markets do not function in a vacuum. Markets function in a certain institutional context. And down the years, India has been too centralized. There are all kinds of legacy issues connected with the way we inherited a post-colonial kind of system. For the first time, that institutional reform is happening. Also part of that institutional reform is the legal system. The legal system is also in some sense part of the infrastructure, and if the legal system does not deliver satisfactorily, then obviously you cannot have growth and development. Linked to that is the issue of decentralization and the role of the states. If one looks at the trajectory of India's growth since 1991, the first decade contrasts very neatly with what happened in the subsequent decades. In the first decade following 1991, that particular decade of the 90s, the states which grew really fast were the traditionally regarded forward states. What has begun to change since the 2000s is the fact that many of the traditionally backward states have begun to grow faster. And in many of these states, there is plenty of slack in the system because, as I said earlier, the land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship labor is not efficiently used. And there is enough slack in that system for the traditionally backward states to drive that growth impetus. The next point I want to make is a point that's already been mentioned, which is the citizen involvement in the process. To my mind, the citizen involvement in the process of governance and development began to happen towards the second half of the 80s. It may have increased in importance in recent years, but that's when it really began to happen. All of these fuel that process, trigger that process towards that $10 trillion economy. Growth tends to have an exponential kind of angle, which sometimes is very difficult to appreciate. Today, if I sit down with that base and I look at 2030, in the year 2030, India's overall national income, depending on your growth assumptions, will be somewhere between 6.5 to 7 trillion US dollars. 2030, somewhere between 6.5 to 7 trillion US dollars, depending on the growth assumptions you are making. So by 2030, we will fall short of that 10 trillion. However, there is one bit that economists find very difficult to predict, and that bit is a bit about what happens to the exchange rate. If you go back and read the first Goldman Sachs report on BRICS and their projections, about 1/3 of that increase was because of an appreciation in the exchange rate. So if the exchange rate is what it is today, then 6.5 to 7 trillion in 2030, 10 trillion in the decade of the leading up to 2040, perhaps around 2035. If the exchange rate appreciates, perhaps we'll get there faster. But all of this is about the overall macroeconomy. Some of you are aware of the work, even though you may not know him by name, of Professor Madison and his followers and successors and colleagues who have tried to drag back economic development in the world to something like 1 AD, 1 ACE. And you will also be aware that there are reports suggesting that India accounted for a very, very large share of world GDP then. Indeed it did, but that was in the aggregate. If you go back and look at that kind of work, the per capita income in India wasn't remarkably higher than that in, let's say, Western Europe. So here also, when we are talking about 10 trillion, we are talking about the overall size, and size does matter. And it is because of the size that India's role in terms of global economic clout will also enhance considerably as we move towards that 10 trillion. But behind that 10 trillion is a per capita figure. And that per capita figure, depending on your assumptions, around the year 2030 will be about 4,000 US dollars. Is 4,000 US dollars high or low? Depends on what kind of comparisons you're making with whom. 4,000 US dollars in 2030 will still be less than that in many countries in the world. 4,000 US dollars means India will still be relatively poor, although the nature of the poverty then in India will be completely different. 2030 is what? It's 13 years away. Cast your mind back to what India was like 13 years ago and ask yourself, 13 years ago, would you have been able to predict the kind of changes that have happened in India? The answer is no. These changes are impossible to predict with any degree of certainty. What is certain is that 10 trillion, 7 trillion, 4,000 US dollars per capita in the year 2030, India will be a remarkably different country. Last sentence, last point. To me, the story of India is the following. It is imperfectly understood in terms of rural-urban. It is imperfectly understood in terms of states. To me, what is happening in India is there are 600,000 villages. Before the last 20 years, about 150,000 were already integrated into the so-called mainstream. In the last 20 odd years, perhaps another 250,000 have now got integrated. And that is inclusion in all of its different senses. Transport, financial, all of it. The story of the next 13 years will be the ones that have not so far been brought into the mainstream, being brought into the mainstream. And it is that transformation which will really change the face of India. The integration of the 150,000 villages, the smaller villages which are still not integrated. Thank you once again, Scotch. Thank you once again, Samir. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.